Hello there, and welcome to Under the Dome from Town Meeting TV. My name's Bobby Lucier. Under the Dome is our coverage of the Vermont legislature, connecting you with the decision makers that represent you down in Montpelier. And today we have a special episode of Under the Dome focused on education funding as Town Meeting Day comes up, and we are looking at school budgets here across the state that are much higher than they were in previous years. And there's a lot of different factors that are playing into the education funding picture this year, and we are very lucky to be joined by Representative Carol Odie, as well as Senator Martine LaRocque-Ulick, who are going to share with us a little of this very confusing and massive landscape of education funding. So thank you both for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Awesome. So I'm going to start with a really big picture, just if I can ask you all to just sort of explain at the highest level, how does Vermont fund its schools?
Okay. Well, I'll start with that one. And before I even start with that one, I want to say that Martine and I fully support the work of the school board and the superintendent, and fully support the school budget for Burlington. And back way a long time ago, in 1997, the Supreme Court in Vermont said, you are not adequately and fairly funding education in this state. So things had to change. And Act 60 came out of that, and later Act 68. And what we do is we collect all the property taxes, and then we give them out. Mm-hmm. And this has to do with what's happening now in Montpelier. You would not give them out equally for every child. You would give it out to children based on their needs. And so that would be weighting the children, weighting the students. And so a high school student, everybody knows, costs more to educate than an elementary school mm-hmm. student. We have sports and clubs and extracurriculars, all kinds of things at the high school that we don't have to pay for at the elementary schools. So they were weighted at the beginning at 1.25, so a little bit more than 1. But back then, the superintendent in Winooski, George Cross, and I was on the school board at that time in Burlington, we knew that we also needed a weight for EL students, English language learning students. And we were only able to get a very tiny weight for them, 0.1. So what happened over the years is we never had the correct weights in the original formula. And then I knew that, and when I got to Montpelier as a legislator in 1990, and 2017 was my first January there, I worked with others, and we got a study. So we would empirically study how students should be weighted. And that is what we have before us in Act 127.
I was just going to add, I think it's important to know that before Act 60 and 68, which really tried to equalize and add equity to the funding landscape in Vermont, we had gold towns and non-gold towns, and these gold towns that were quite wealthy were able to contribute more and have a more robust and well-resourced school district and schools. And that was, when these two acts came around as Vermont, as a state, we decided to say, this isn't equitable. You shouldn't get an education based on where you live, or the quality of your education should not be based primarily on where you live. So that's why, these acts came around to try to, make a more equitable landscape, and which I would say was achieved. And as much as we have a complex, maybe a little bit of a Byzantine funding formula and way to pay for education, it is very equitable. And so we can really be proud of that in the work that we're doing.
That's complex but equitable. So then Act 127 fixed those weights, but that meant that we in Burlington, all other things being equal, at the same tax rate, would then get more money back to run our schools than before. But that also meant that at the same tax rate, the schools who had been overweighted were going to really suffer. So what would we do to help them? And what we tried, and the House, the Senate, and the governor all signed off on this method, was to cap the, put a cap in, a 5% cap in, to protect the schools that were most impacted. As it turns out, this happened in a year where instead of single-digit increases in budgets, which is what we had been seeing, it was a year when there were huge increases, 18 to 20% increases in budgets, just generally.
Right.
And that's for a number of reasons, which I think Martine will go into in a moment. But anyway, we saw that this was playing out, and we said, we have to get rid of the caps. So you'll see, H850 gets rid of the cap, and it also allows the Secretary of State to go in and allow budgets to be rewarned if school boards want to go back and rewarn them. Now, a lot of school districts who were spending up to the cap, who didn't absolutely need to, like they didn't have to put in a new roof, but they decided, well, there's a cap, we're going to do it. They will then, we think, will bring that spending down from a $250 million increase statewide to much less, maybe 200 or less million statewide.
Can I give a little bit of background to 127? Because
Yes.
you gave a good explanation of the weights. I think it's important for folks to know that Act 127 from last year, right, 2022?
Yeah,
2023, was correcting weights that had been determined about 25 years ago. So they were long overdue for an update. And Act 127 was really looking at EL students, students living in poverty, and students living in rural areas of the state. So, marginalized communities that really needed a little bit more of a boost in terms of their weighting. So I wanted to give a little bit of an update on that. Act 127 is a relatively new piece of legislation.
This is the first year that it's
Totally new.
Yeah.
And totally needed for Burlington.
Yes.
And that was something that was very hard to achieve, this change, and we did it
Yeah.
with many people working together for that change. Okay, so we have this great formula for everyone, because if it's not fair for one, it's not fair for anybody. We have the H850 fixing a cap that all of us thought might work and didn't. Now we have school spending. Why did it go up so much? Martine, I know you have things to say about this.
Yes, I do. So I could talk really broadly about some frustrations that I see in the landscape, but maybe I'll get to that a little bit later. Up close and personal, what we've seen this year are healthcare costs that have been up. What did we say?
16.8%.
16.8%, which
But
is
that's going up for people who are buying
which
healthcare
is not a local.
everywhere.
It's not a local decision. This is a statewide, contract that is negotiated. So that was something that was out of our control, obviously.
Out of school board's control.
Out of the Burlington School Board's control, exactly. It was state level. ESSER and ARPA funds that were incredibly helpful during the pandemic have dried up, are going away. They helped put in place mental health supports. ARPA was, really geared towards some building updates like HVAC systems so that, you could have ventilation and good air in schools. But there were just these needed supports that money came in and really helped with. So the fact that it's going away has been difficult, especially around the counseling, mental health, bringing in healthcare providers into school, as well as some, just all kinds of supports that were greatly needed that came from, internally in the school district, but also like Howard Mental Health and other folks who came in and were able to help, counselors. So that was a biggie.
Also learning needs.
Learning needs as well.
Learning loss.
Absolutely, learning loss. So we have that. We also have, as Carol and I were talking about in the car, inflation, which is something that is out of our control. We have an administration in Washington that's doing their best, but we've got these, basically a war in Ukraine. We've got issues with supply chain in and out of China. So that's been difficult and problematic, to say the least. So that's another issue.
And that is, inflation is coming under control and is coming down. Still, in our school budgets, that has to be accounted for.
Yep. We also had, we had to negotiate contracts, and it was a tough year to negotiate contracts because coming out of the pandemic, there was this thinking and adequately, and it was real, that we were going to be losing teachers and administrators. It was so hard to be a teacher and an administrator during the pandemic. And I think a lot of folks are deciding to leave the profession. We see it all across the country. So that negotiation piece was much more competitive as it needed to be. So we did see wages and, as I said earlier, benefits go up as well. So that was another stressor. What else am I missing?
Well, the sales tax, the property taxes aren't the only thing that go into the education fund. Also sales and use taxes. 100% of sales and use taxes go into the education fund to help pay for education. And in fact, 100% of lottery proceeds go there, 33% of the vehicle purchase and use, and 25% of the rooms and meals and alcohol taxes go there. So it's not just property taxes paying for our schools. So the sales and use tax went way up during the pandemic by millions, tens of millions of dollars. People were buying. They were buying things and renovating the kitchen or renovating their homes and doing all kinds of things. And then with that extra revenue, we used the extra revenue to buy down what otherwise would have been increasing property taxes. So we used some of it to buy that down because we thought, well, we shouldn't just sit on the money when we could give property tax relief. And then some of it we used, millions and millions, we put into reserve and into funds that would help us going forward. However, now sales and use tax revenue has gone more down to where it was. And so now there isn't anything to use to buy down tax rates on property. And so now that has been another reason that property taxes are going up. Because the education fund is a closed fund. What goes into it, and then local school boards make their decisions about what to spend, and then we at the state level set a yield, and then we send out the money to cover the school budget costs.
Right, and to your earlier question about how does the education fund work, it all goes into this big pot and then it gets distributed out. I have to talk about school construction costs because even though Burlington, we're building a new high school and we're going to bear the brunt of the cost of that new high school, it will be borne by everyone in Vermont. Same thing if they're doing a project at Woodstock Elementary School, eventually everyone in the state has a share in the work being done on that school because of the way we draw funds out of the ed fund. So,
and in fact, I want to say that when I first got to Montpelier, I thought, we need to put back in construction aid, where we would get 1/3 construction aid or 1/2 construction aid. But the way the formula works, Act 68 works, we're better off without that construction aid. We get more help to do our buildings in Burlington under the formula than we would with a straight percentage. However,
we being
going
Burlington.
Yeah. However, going forward, going forward, there is a construction task force that met, and they and now our education committee that Martine's on, and then the education committee in the House, and I know our House Ways and Means Committee will be looking at how we go forward with school construction aid, because we know that many school buildings are contaminated or just aging, have lead pipe issues,
we have the
all kinds of
second
things.
oldest school building stock in the country. It is pathetic. They're dangerous. Some of them are dangerous. I mean, so something has to be done. We have to take bold action. Part of what came out of the school construction aid task force, though, is also we are going to have to think very seriously about can we sustain all of these school buildings? We have some schools that have 40, 45 children in them. We have a school, I won't necessarily bring up towns with 100, 200 empty seats. So we really are going to have to take a close look at how we move forward. Where do we invest our money? We can't necessarily invest in every single structure that we have.
Well, we can't. We won't.
Yeah. Well, and just so take for example the Burlington High School, do we know how much of that is actually being paid by Burlington taxpayers versus paid by the state, or is that kind of
So
difficult to
far,
put?
we know. We know that we were able to get $3.5 million for Burlington to renovate the space at Macy's, but no money toward the payment of the lease. Then we know that we were able to get $16.3 million, I think, toward,
Which we haven't gotten yet, by the way.
yes, that's a problem, toward the cost of removing the PCBs and disposing of them. So that much so far we have. Then within the formula itself, there's help for us.
But that is a good question, and I don't know if we can determine.
We could.
We could.
We
Okay.
could. I'd have to work
We'll
it out.
have to get back to you on that one.
Okay, good to know.
But we will, through the formula, everyone will be paying a part of our high school costs.
Right. Okay. So we've talked about in Burlington. There are so many factors going on in the education funding right now. There's the high school bond. There's Act 127, and then there's also the CLA. And the CLA was, I remember when Superintendent Flanagan came in and talked about, that they worked really hard to make sure that their increase, even if that 5% cap from Act 127 was removed, would only be a little bit over 5%. And then they were hit with this huge CLA number. So. Is the CLA, the Common Level Appraisal process, working properly?
Well, it is, just the way the weights work properly. We get taken into account, we could change that, but as it exists now in the formula, just as the weights take into account equity for our school children and our property taxpayers, the Common Level of Appraisal takes into account equity from town to town. So towns aren't sending in too little or too much, depending on the value of the real estate in the town.
Right.
It could be changed.
Right.
But right now, this is another pandemic issue. Many people sought refuge here in Vermont when the pandemic was happening. Some people stayed and they're working remotely. Some people bought sight unseen property, driving up the cost, and they don't even stay here. They just want to have it as an insurance policy because we're such a great state. And then there are some investors who've come in and bought up housing and are making money on renting it rather than having it available for people to buy and live in. So that exacerbates our housing crisis.
Right.
But these things have driven up grand lists, would expand the tax base, which is great, and that lowers property taxes overall. However, it depends on where the prices, where the fair market value is highest to see who is going to be most impacted when the shifts happen, so that everybody is basically paying on 100% of their assessed value.
Right. Okay. So it sounds like the story. I'm trying to just sort of capture what's going on with the Burlington budget. Folks are voting on a budget that represents 15.6% increase in their education property taxes, right? And that's, the school tried their best to balance out the programmatic increases with programmatic cuts, and then had to service the bond for the Burlington High School and had to deal with an increase related to basically market value for property in Burlington skyrocketing during the pandemic. Both of those things are up against a school district that has tried to is not spending way out of their pocket in terms of what's actually in this budget.
Yeah, there's not a lot of new spending in this budget. I think everyone did their utmost to try to keep, things level. We have invested in things like literacy just because there's been an outcry and well deserved outcry across the state that our literacy scores are low, and that we need to get kids reading again and reading up to the level where they should be. So Burlington has invested in that. And if you wanted to pull up the...
Yeah, I think we have it here, and we can ask Kevin if you could pull up the graphic here. Yep.
you can see there's the ballot language that is on the ballots that all of us should have at home now. Mine came last week. And there, yep, so you've got your total budget there of,
Was this last year's?
oh
This
shoot,
looks like
you know what?
FY24.
Yeah, you do have that is last
FY
year's.
Well, while you get
25
pull up
planning.
the-
Okay, there we go. Sorry, there we go. Okay,
I was going to
that's
say,
better.
that seems slow, but yeah, so we are up this year to 104.1 million. So yeah, wages, health insurance, and debt service and utilities, that was all up, close to $6 million. And those are things that, again, I explained why the wages are up, and then the health insurance was beyond our control. Same with the debt service and utilities. Then you do see that the borrowing is coming up for the new high school. We did have to bond for that, $165 million. And then you do have some strategic plan investments, like I was talking about, literacy, leadership, recruitment, and mental health. We worked on the strategic plan a few years back, and it was a really robust community project. And we are staying true to the plan that we put forth. And so it really does behoove us to invest in those 4 priority areas. Then you can see that we also have reductions in central office staff and for FTE teaching positions. So those reductions do offset the investments that we've made in the strategic plan. So you still end up with that 14.84 increase because of the things that we talked about earlier.
Right.
I want to go quickly back to the CLA. We do have in process now a way to separate property tax types so that the burden of property taxes can be shifted somewhat to second homeowners or to whatever we decide to shift it to, away from primary household.
Is that something that's in effect now or something that
No,
you're working on? Okay.
It will be nothing, it's in process now.
Yep.
We don't have as many levers to help this year, but going forward, we will be working both on financing levers and on education, how we structure education in this state to bring down the cost to property taxpayers.
Right.
And I just want to be sure that you know that the current statewide situation truly is untenable. We cannot increase spending like this. Property taxpayers cannot bear this burden, and the state can't bear this burden. So sometimes it takes what's happening now statewide, such an increase in education spending, to make the hard changes and choices that have to be made. And this is something that happened back before, when the Brigham decision came into effect. It was untenable what was happening then and untenable now. So we got great change coming out of that, and we'll have to make these changes now going forward. It's not going to be easy, but it has to be done.
No, I agree, and feel free to chime in. But as Vice Chair of Senate Education, I am calling for, and I know I'm not the only one doing this, but I'm calling for really a moment where we can bring all stakeholders to the table. So I think we need educators, we need business folks, we need folks who are really invested in our approved independent schools or private schools. We need economists, everyone coming to the table to talk about where we are and where we're going to go. I don't feel, as someone who is working on an education committee, that we have a strategic plan. If it's there, I haven't seen it, and I'm certainly not living under it. So we need a plan, we need some guardrails for the next 20, 25 years. We know that Dan French, the Secretary of Education, left almost a year ago. I think the governor announced that March 17th of 2023. It's been almost a year. We've had an interim secretary. So the leadership is not there. And so that would be a start. And things that we need to look at, I've already talked about our school building stock, which is incredibly old and decrepit. So looking at where we're going to invest our money, what schools might need to close. We love local control in Vermont. We love to make budget decisions at a very localized level, but that is expensive and it's often inefficient. So we're going to have to look at how do we shore up our efficiency and on a statewide level. And I really think with efficiency will come a better handle on economics and on increases.
And when we did work on Act 127 and the weights, there was a summer study committee, and they understood, they were told by Tammy Colby, if you are fixing the weights, you must also look at some kind of a foundation formula where you decide an amount of money that would be adequate for education spending. At any amount above that, and it would be weighted for the students, but any amount above that has to be very expensive dollar for you to raise. Right now, it's too easy to raise your spending for many places. It hasn't been easy for Burlington, but it's been easy for some others. And so it has to be hard for all of us to make the decision to spend more than what an adequate amount per pupil would be. And in fact, we just took testimony last week regarding how to begin that work. And I think that's one of the next steps is whether that will work for us.
Right. And we've touched on it a little bit, but just when push comes to shove here, this year, I mean, before the cap was repealed, it sounded like the education fund was looking at like a serious deficit. And so what will the actual impacts be in schools between, the proposed funding that is being requested of the education fund and what the education fund can actually bear? What does that mean in schools? Or should we expect to see a reduction in sort of teachers or increased class sizes, or what will it look like for this for at least for this year?
Yeah, I think in some communities that might be losing some taxing capacity, these are schools that have been sort of overweighted potentially for the last 20, 25 years. Those areas, if they're losing some taxing capacity, they are going to have to make some decisions as to whether to increase their spending or make some cuts and create some efficiencies in what they're doing. And that, we've sort of said that all along as we were looking at 127, was at some point, there has to be a balancing out of the funding and of the resources.
Well, we still have, now in H 850, we took away the cap, but we did provide a penny per percent of harm that you would incur. So those districts most impacted by the new funding formula will have a lot of help.
Yep.
Then there'll be places many places that saw the way Act 127 was working out and decided there's room for us to put more in spending into our budgets without feeling a negative impact. Without the cap, they will feel the negative impact. I expect that those budgets will certainly either fail or they'll go back to the voters with a different first budget that will be less.
Yep.
So the education spending will go from a $250 million issue, maybe down maybe by $50 million, we think, possibly.
But
will still be $200 million with a problem. And because of all the things that we just talked about.
It is important, though, can I just bust in for 1 second, to not conflate Act 127 with education spending, right? Act 127 has no bearing on education spending or the amount of money that's in the ed fund. It's a redistribution of monies, right? And I heard a lot of people conflating that in the Senate and the House over the last couple weeks. But as Senator Bruth, the pro tem, said at one point, like I said earlier, we've made these local spending decisions, right? And that is what ultimately puts the pressure on the ed fund, not Act 127. So it's important for people to keep those separate.
Yeah. Well, this brings up a question for me also. I mean, this is maybe a little bit more forward-looking, but so we've relied on property taxes for a long time to fund our education system. Do we know for sure that that's the best way to fund education, or is there an alternative that we should be considering?
Well, there was an income tax study to see should income taxes be used more or instead to fund education. And that study can be found online at the Joint Fiscal office webpage, and the upshot of that was it's very it may not be able to be workable at all. But then taking a step back, Act 60 and 68 are income protection acts. They protect 70% of property taxpayers from paying property tax. They do not pay property tax. They pay a tax based on their income. So they're protected. 30% of Vermonters are paying on their property. So there's there's already income protection, and
Right. Okay. So there is already an income element.
There is a
for
big
folks who are
income
under
element.
a certain level of income. They're not paying a percentage of their property
certain level
tax.
of income and a certain amount that their property is worth.
Okay. And then I'll ask one other follow-up, which is sort of mechanical. So there's the homestead tax
Yes.
rate and then the non-homestead. Can you
Yes.
explain the difference between those two?
Well, a homestead is your home and the 2 acres that surround it, and anything beyond that is taxed at a different rate.
Okay.
And also, that's for principal dwellings. That's a homestead. It's a principal dwelling where people actually live. Then there's the non-homestead. If it's not your principal residence, if you are a business, if you are a landlord who rents out property, if you're manufacturing, everything that isn't a home is non-homestead. And those two things are taxed at different rates.
And
But
which
over
ones?
the years,
Yeah.
those things have been somewhat, many years ago, those things were different, pretty different from year to year. Now, they're always within a certain ratio of each other in the past number of years. That is a lever that we have. We could increase the burden on the non-homestead in favor of the homestead, your primary residence.
Right.
We could do that.
Do we have a sense of like what proportion of the education fund's revenue is coming from homestead tax versus non-homestead, or
Don't have that number right here.
Is it roughly similar, or is it one like a much larger source than the other one?
I can't speak to
No.
that right
Okay.
this moment.
That's okay.
Sorry.
That's okay.
It's a great question. It's not that I haven't seen it before. I just don't have it in my mind right now.
Totally. I know that you guys are also balancing a million other bills in your head right now.
right.
So I appreciate you guys coming and talking about this with all of your expertise on it. So, I mean, one thing that I read recently, the governor signed 850 and also kind of seemed to take a little jab at, I mentioned, I had an approach for cost containment and cost control that nobody listened to me. I mean, what's the governor's approach to controlling costs, and how might that differ from the legislative leadership's approach? If you can speak to that.
Well, the first thing I'd like to say, backing up, is we all signed on, including him, to Act 127.
Yep.
He signed it, both houses passed it. And now we started Act H 850 in the House, went to the Senate, he signed it. So we're in accord with that. For what we do moving forward, probably our goals are similar: to have better schools producing where kids do better, and where the burden on property taxpayers and the burden on taxpayers of all kinds is as low as it can be, while still having a great education, great schools. So how exactly we're going to move forward, well, we're all struggling a little bit right now to figure that out. And as I said, we're working on how we can separate out the non-homestead into different sections of how things will be taxed. Working on something that the governor was very much in favor of, which was to have the health care negotiated at the statewide level, and that turns out to be possibly costing a little more than if it weren't done at the statewide level. But we have an idea for how to fix that, which is to make sure that when talks break down and people go to and the sides go to arbitration, that cost containment is something considered by the arbitrator moving forward in how things are settled for the.
And from my point of view, to your question, the governor didn't give us a clear path on how to achieve his goal of keeping costs down, other than cutting, from my perspective, other than cutting salaries and benefits. I'm not aware of again, strategic plan, I have to bring it up, for the state. It just wasn't clear to me. And cutting benefits and salaries would mean a departure of more teachers, so a limited workforce. How are we going to educate our kids? To me, it's just not a clear path, and it's not a sustainable plan. So, we're doing what we can with a less than perfect situation, for sure. So anyway, I bristle a little bit sometimes at some of what's said in terms of our education system in the state.
I like to think that if the governor and the legislature are on the same page in terms of quality of education and the least amount of burden on taxpayers possible, which I can't imagine that anybody isn't on board with that, then we just have to figure out a path forward. And that's tough. And there'll be disagreements here and there, and I got a little into the weeds when I said about a couple of the things that we could be looking at, but basically, we have work to do to accomplish this. It's not easy.
Yep. And I want to jump back, but we only have a few minutes, maybe a little more than 5 minutes left here, but I want to jump back to the construction, because that's something that I've always been kind of curious about. So is there, I've heard the phrase that there's like a moratorium on state funding school construction costs, and I don't know, is that accurate? What is the state's role in funding school construction right now, and how is that limiting places that really need school construction right now?
Years ago, when I was on the school board, we had a percentage of your building project was paid for by the state. We don't have that anymore. On the other hand, the formula does help us for what we're spending on education, our education spending, that's in the formula, that is impacted by the debt that we take on to pay for construction. And we're helped in the formula to the extent that we're all helped by, we're helped a little bit more because we have a lot of children in need in our city.
But there are smaller districts in rural areas in the state where they used to get 30% from the state for construction aid, and that dried up in 2007, or it went away. And I did hear from a lot of superintendents who said, it's really hard when you live in a small community with, a lot of poverty, to go to your voters and ask to approve a budget that has a new roof on it, when you actually need 3 more teachers to meet the needs of the kids. And so in these small towns and these smaller districts, over and over and over again, budgets would go down and something had to get cut, and often instead of the teachers, it would be the roof project. So over time, as you keep deferring that maintenance because you want to put it into programs that will directly impact kids, you see your building stock just decline and decline and decline over years. And that's where we're at right now.
Okay.
Sad situation.
But what we can do is strategically fund new building and repair of buildings. And that's where tough decisions can be made that will, in the end, bring down the cost of education in the state, because we can't possibly fix every school building in the state.
Yep.
It would cost $300 million a year for 30 years, and that is not sustainable.
Do we have time for a few more minutes?
Yeah. Well, I was gonna sort of wrap up with a question of, do you have something to add on that point, or do you have something else? Or
something just really brief, and maybe we can have a show some other time, which is just some sort of real structural inequities that we have in our system. We have a sort of a voucher system that would be compared to a system that exists in some more Republican and red states. And I I think we should start, as we're putting everything on the table to look at moving forward, we need to start unpacking if this is the system that we want to have. We have these we call them independent, approved independent schools, but they're basically private schools that accept public dollars. And those schools don't have to live by the same rules as our public schools. So we have this bifurcated system where we have some schools that live by this 2200 series rule series, and then other schools that are governed by law, Title 16, and very stringent federal guidelines as well. So about $100 million a year flow from our public pockets to private schools that aren't governed by the same rules. And so it's important to understand, I mean, if that's the system that we love in Vermont and we want to keep it, then that's what it will be. But I think it's something that we need to talk about because it is public dollars that are going to private institutions. And for some folks, I think that's problematic.
Yeah. Is there any legislative effort to change that?
There have been some really great efforts, mainly coming out of the House, but they haven't really moved beyond that, unfortunately. They come over to the Senate and they tend to get stalled. So we'll see. We'll see what happens in the future. But like I said, I think everything should be on the table because we are at a sort of a tipping point, and some folks would say in sort of a crisis mode right now.
Right. Okay, well, we have to wrap it up here. I want to ask, just if you in the last 60 seconds here, as voters go to the ballot box this town meeting day, and they're considering, this is going to have a big impact on my tax bill, but I want to, support education in the state. What do you suggest? How do you suggest voters think about education funding this year and in years to come?
I would just say support it this year and look forward to making big structural changes across the state that will make our system more sustainable.
Carol?
I would say the same. And to know that we're in Montpelier working very hard to make the changes that need to be made moving forward.
Great. Awesome. Representative Carlodi, Senator Martine LaRocque-Gulick, thank you both so much for coming in and talking about this this tricky topic. I appreciate you both making some time to chat about it. And thank you so much for tuning in to Under the Dome from Town Meeting TV. You can find this and many other programs on cctv.org/2024, our coverage of the Town Meeting Day local elections. Thanks so much and so long.